studied this horsemanship in America. I've worked with the greatest. I'm working in Europe. I'm getting some pretty good results. I'm still running into trouble with some horses. And we've called this thing equitation ethologic, and I don't know much about science. Can you help me? And so luckily I got a lot of help in the science department and started reading, studying, and funnily enough, I didn't actually think that it would be that I'd get as passionate about the subject as I did. And the science, it just clears everything up. Hello everybody, Andy Booth with you again. So I'm clicking back into English mode. I'm realizing this week as I'm doing a few videos in English that I speak French much more than I speak English, so I'll be looking around for my words a little bit from time to time, so you'll just have to be a bit patient with me. I've been teaching over here for about 15 or 20 years now. I guess in the first years teaching here in France, sometimes I'd teach a kind of a franglais, a little bit of French, a little bit of English, and there was enough people who could understand me and often had to have a translator alongside. But for about the last 15 years I've just been teaching in French, and I realised that I actually find the words a little bit easier in France, in French, just through experience. But the things I've picked up over here, I suppose in the beginning when I first moved over here to Europe, I was bringing a lot of things from Australia and from America, a lot of the good horsemanship that I'd picked up in those cultures, and I was bringing that here. And then in the last 15 to 20 years I've picked up a lot of things here, and I think probably should give something back to the other side, if that makes any sense. So okay, well there's things over here, and you know, the sports results that you're seeing in whether it be in dressage or show jumping or whatever of those disciplines you might be looking at, you know, those results aren't just happening by accident. So there's some pretty good stuff going on here in Europe, and there was a lot of good stuff from the horsemanship that I brought over here that they didn't really know about, particularly in the foundation training. So, you know, when I first looked at wastage statistics over here in Europe, there was some pretty big wastage statistics. Quite a lot of horses, especially in the foundation training, quite a lot of horses running into trouble, and they could be horses that might, you know, normally worth quite a bit of money, running into trouble during the, as we'd say in Australia, the breaking in phase. So in the starting phase, those horses were getting into difficulty. And if you weren't getting a solid foundation on those horses, it was pretty hard to build the rest. People were filling in the spaces and getting something done, but then when the pressure really got on, when they had to get out there in public in front of thousands of people in some pretty, as I say, hostile environments, you know, with big flashy screens and lots of people and lots of noise, you know, the horses were running into all sorts of stress problems. And this is where all the colic and the ulcers, the stomach ulcers, and a lot of immunity problems, you know, horses getting a lot of skin problems and things. Often people don't see the relationship between, you know, my horse has got a lot of skin problems, and so they're trying to treat the symptoms instead of treating the cause, and that's a very sort of European medicine thing, isn't it? Rather than treating the cause of the problem, just go for the symptoms. So, you know, the horse has got skin problems, but, you know, of course, you know, anyone that's been around a while and knows what stress is, or knows someone who knows what stress is, we all know that, you know, a lot of those skin problems that happen, you know, whether you're getting itchy spots or whatever it is, you know, a lot of those things are related to stress. So if things aren't going well in the horse's head, they're not going to be going well in his body, and vice versa. So you've got to have the body going well, and you've got to have the head going well. And I would say over here in Europe, they had mastered the horse's body, but they just hadn't mastered the horse's mind. And in the more, probably, I might say the more Western culture, or the working culture, those where we work with horses as a working animal, you know, whether it be working cattle or different sort of cowboy work, there we were getting, you know, really good control over the horse's mind, but weren't probably, especially in the early days, maybe the 70s, 80s, maybe not so interested in getting the horse's body and how we might be teaching the horse to do sort of higher level movements. Of course, Western sports have taken off since then, and people are getting more and more in control of the mind and the body. But if your horse isn't, you know, mentally, emotionally and physically going well, you've got a pretty big hole in the program. And I think having been in the more sort of horsemanship culture, and then moving over here where it's kind of more technical. There's a lot of equestrian technique, and it's very mechanical. They're technicians, but they're not necessarily psychologists. They're having trouble getting into the horse's head. And in the Western culture, or where I was before in Australia and in America, they were getting into the horse's head, but they weren't so much getting into the technique, into the equestrian technique. So bringing all those things together is really interesting. And other things that came together, and that's why I'll talk a little bit now about how horseman science came into place, is that I found in the horsemanship, we're trying to understand the horse's mind, and there were great techniques in there, especially based upon getting control of the horse's feet. So if you could get control of the horse's feet, you could get control of the horse's mind. And that sort of changes everything. I think when you figure out that there's only 4 feet, and if you can get the 2 back ones under control and the 2 front ones, and you've got forward and backwards, so you've got forwards, backwards, isolate the hind quarter or isolate the forequarter. Once you've got that under control, basically the human starts having, and in science we call that stimulus control over the horse's movement. Now there's only 2 things that can really have stimulus control over the horse's movement. It's either the human or it's the environment, and unfortunately for a lot of horses, they're under stimulus control from the environment but not from under the human. And if you want stimulus control, it's got to be really accurate. It's got to be very, very precise. I mean, there's, with training dogs, there's a clear code that gets a clear response. You can't say sit so that the dog sits down, and also sit so that he comes here, and sit so that he goes outside, and sit so that he stays over there. You've got to have one word, one response, and it's got to obtain the response within a short period of time. And you can't be repeating the word or the code or the cue without getting the response, otherwise that cue kind of loses all its sense. So it's got to be very precise. And one of the things I think I really learnt here in France, and we see it a lot in Germany as well, is precision, is really making sure that one aid gets one response and the horse understands very, very clearly those aids. And what I found is, we've got these really high-level sport horses. These are Formula Ones, as I call them. And they're highly strung. There's a lot of blood in there. They're pretty hot. And so stop has to mean stop. This is kind of non-negotiable. And I think sometimes, we can get a little bit approximative in our horse training. And you wouldn't want to do that with these sport horses. Stop needs to mean stop. Go needs to mean go. Turn needs to mean turn. And you can't sort of have any negotiation about that. You can't cut a deal and say, well, if you want to stop, we'll stop. But if it's really not fitting into your plans at that time, we'll kind of cut a deal on that and we'll stop a bit later. Stopping a bit later can be pretty dangerous. I remember once close to Paris giving a demonstration. There was a lot of Americans there. And someone, was saying, well, if you were over in Montana, you'd really want to get a good stop on a horse, because if he doesn't stop, well, you could go for miles. And I remember laughing and explaining afterwards, well, if you've got a lot of miles, like I sometimes started horses in Australia, some spots around in Queensland, if you went out and you kind of ran into a bit of a brakes problem, well, there was quite a few acres out there in front of you, you get a couple of thousand acres where you might be able to stop his feet. So, but over here, stop needs to mean stop. There's kind of a road turns up every 200 meters or even, maybe a kilometre away, but there's a lot of roads, there's a lot of traffic, there's a lot of fences, everything's kind of squeezed into a little place. So stop needs to mean stop, and you can't be, can't get any sort of wishy-washy about that. It needs to be really clear. One of the things that, when I started looking more at science, is that it was that clarity. Is saying, okay, stop is stop. There's no deal on that. Go is go, woe is woe, turn is turn. And we need to explain these things really, really clearly. And also the benefits that come with that. Now, it's not just, you do that probably to have a better performance or to have better control. But the benefit is that suddenly the horse gets more focused on the rider and less focused on the environment. Probably one of the biggest things that has improved here in the last few years is really understanding that it's the removal of the aid that gets the response and not the application. I think, even little things like I've been watching the prize giving ceremonies over here in the last 20 odd years. It's improved a lot. People running into lots of trouble because they're trying to hold a horse still, and what they're not doing is allowing the horse to make the mistake, correcting it, making the wrong thing uncomfortable, releasing the reins when the horse is right, and then taking the reins again when he's getting it wrong, when he's running into trouble. And so they're trying to hold, 600 kilos of sport horse in one place, and then all of a sudden it starts rearing and jumping and spinning and all of those sort of things. So one of the things that really has improved, I think, over here in the last while is understanding that make the right thing easy. When the horse gets it right, make sure that he can appreciate the fact that he's getting it right, and also making the wrong thing difficult, but not getting it the wrong way around. And a lot of things, I think, in horsemanship, a lot of times when we're not really aware of what we're doing, we're getting things the wrong way around. Another example is, so if we look at the science of learning, there's associative learning, where we're trying to teach responses to different stimuli, and then there's non-associative learning, where we're trying to teach the horse not to respond to certain things. And people sometimes get it a bit mixed up, and so they're putting the fly spray on the horse, and when he moves, they think, oh, he's getting a bit scared, he's getting a bit bothered, so they take the fly spray away, and they're actually conditioning the horse to respond. They're saying, well, if I put the fly spray on, if you move, I stop. So they're teaching the horse move from fly spray, and then they're getting upset and punishing the horse when he moves away from the fly spray. And these are basic, horsemanship things that, whilst the equestrian culture was really good, there was big holes in their horsemanship programs. And I think if we want to succeed with horses, we need both. We need the equestrian culture. We need to know how to train the horse to do appropriate and correct maneuvers, especially stop and go. It doesn't really matter what you do. People say, oh, I only do trail riding, I don't really need to train the horse. Well, all they're doing is changing the location of the accident. You still need to stop, and you still need to go, and you still need to turn. And these things get really important. The day you're out there riding down on a road and there's a creek or something that goes through and the horse stops, if your go button has holes in it, then you won't cross that creek. You'll run into trouble and there's techniques, but the first thing to do is make sure that go means go, and it's a non-negotiable. If there's a fire there and I say go, well, the horse goes into the fire. I might not ask a horse to do that, but I can't have holes in the program and say, well, sometimes go means go, but sometimes it doesn't. Go's go, woe is woe, and turn is turn, and these things need to be really, really precise. So probably adding science to horsemanship really made things a lot clearer. So good horsemanship, another thing that I sort of figured out when I moved over here is that the way that good horsemanship had been explained to me, there was a lot of what we call anthropomorphism in there, a lot of putting a human brain into the horse's head. So what that means is people were thinking or interpreting problems and situations incorrectly. So I'll just give you a few examples on that. And this is I truly believed, especially the years that I spent in the States, I truly believed that there was a hierarchy, that the human had to be the leader. We used terms such as alpha and all these sort of things. And I was getting good results understanding those things, but sometimes I was misinterpreting certain situations, particularly when things were going a bit wrong, and I was really interpreting the problem as being a lack of respect from the horse. So I'll just talk about that for a minute. People often think that the problem is the horse, and so they're running into troubles with the horse, and they're saying, oh, he's not respecting me. I've even heard, I remember working with a trailer loading problem a while back, and the girl saying to me, the problem is he's not respecting my position as a leader. And I think, no, the problem is the horse is not going into the trailer. It's not about you. It's about the horse. He's not worried about you. He's trying to take care of himself. And so, there's a lot of holes in the program. Did the horse really follow halter pressure? Did he know how to remove the pressure of the halter from his head? Did the horse understand that when the stick comes up, there's a way of making the stick go away without having to tap on the horse? Did the horse, were all the primary responses, the beginning responses, were they clearly conditioned? And so, just go away from the trailer, put the basics in place, come back to the trailer, and also fully understanding positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, how to use them, when to use them, why to use them. And you might find that horse suddenly goes into the trailer. And the person didn't have to go and get a bunch of respect. I remember once working with a South African guy, and the horse, he ran into a bit of trouble, and he said, yeah, I need to give this horse some respect. And basically that meant, I'm going to go around behind the barn and get after him for a while. And of course that poor horse ends up being skittish, poor, afraid thing for a long time afterwards. So one of the questions, and this was a question asked to me by a great scientist, he said, well, when we think about respect, is the horse capable of doing something wrong on purpose? And that's probably one of the most important things in the science of the understanding the horse to understand is the horse capable, in the absence of a prefrontal cortex, is the horse capable of knowing right from wrong and good from bad? Could he actually be wrong? You know, I remember doing clinics with great horsemen and always hearing that word, that phrase come out, he's not doing it to be wrong. And of course, the human in that case there, he couldn't be more right, because the horse couldn't be doing it to be wrong. He wouldn't know how to be. The horse is just trying to do the best he can in the situation he's in. So he's trying to find a way through that situation where he'll suffer as little as possible, and you know, if he could get a bonus out of that, if he could find a way to be comfortable in there, he'd do it. No horse would try to get uncomfortable or would try to run himself into trouble. It wouldn't fit into their program. It doesn't make sense. And no horse would try to be wrong or try to, you know, you hear a lot of things, oh, he's making fun of me, or he's not respecting me, or he's trying to do this, or he's probably not. He's just trying to find his way through the situation the best he can. And sometimes when you're interpreting things wrong, you think, oh, he's not respecting me, so I'll get hard on him. It's probably not what he needs. And it could even lead the human into punishing the horse. Now that'd be pretty catastrophic, because imagine if you were trying to get a horse into a trailer and all of a sudden it all comes undone and you're running into trouble, and now you start getting after the horse and getting cranky with him and banging on him, hitting on him. You know, that horse is going to associate, because that's how they learn. They don't sort of analyze and think about things a whole lot. It's just a horse. So he's just going to associate, when I'm near that trailer, this is what happens. You know, don't go near the trailer. Trailers are bad. And horses, they have this associative learning capacity, and that's about what they do. They just say, this is good and this is bad. This will profit me and this won't profit. You know, I'll profit in this situation, I won't profit in that situation, and they try and find their way through that. But if things are making the horse uncomfortable, he's probably not going to go there. And sometimes people getting after this respect issue and saying, you know, I'm going to make the horse respect me. And they're misinterpreting the situation. The situation isn't that the horse is suddenly lacking respect. He's probably just, there's big holes in the program. And that's where I guess science has really helped, to say, okay, this if you really get the basics right, then you don't have holes in the program, then the horse... And respect has been a really interesting thing for me, because I was kind of leaning on that, I guess. Everything that I looked at as a problem would either come from confidence or respect. You know, the horse was either afraid, it was a fear issue, or it was a respect issue. And when I got over here to Europe and started working with some pretty high-level scientists, and they said, well, you know, respect doesn't actually exist, that was a pretty hard pill to swallow. And it's probably the best thing that ever happened to me in my horsemanship, was understanding that it's not about the horse. He's not trying to get it wrong, and he's not making fun of you, and he's not trying to, you know, find out where you're positioning yourself. Either you've got good stimulus control over what he's doing, or there's big holes in the program and he's lost. And sometimes people think, well, he's not respecting me, but the horse is just lost. He's not trying to do that. He's not trying to be wrong. He's not trying to test your leadership or any of those things. And that one there was pretty hard for me. So that's probably one of the biggest issues in science. And when I figured out that, you just stop taking things personally, and you look at the horse totally differently and say, oh, rather than judging him and saying, you know, how are you analysing me and I'm analysing you, just try and help him and say, okay, how can I help you through this situation? And that will just about change everything in the way you come through it. Brings about a kind of a calm. You're not taking things personally, and you're not getting into fights. And that when you've got these big sport horses over here, fights are pretty good to avoid. You know, you might get in a fight with a little kind of what we call them over here is a paddock cocktails. You know, a horse that's a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and he's a nice little horse. You might get in a fight with him, and even if you win the fight, you lose anyway. But with these big sport horses, getting into a fight with them, that can be pretty dangerous stuff. So you wouldn't want to go there. And also understand that, you know, when you're getting into these fights, these horses are associating the situation. So if you're getting in a fight about a jump, the horse is associating the jump with the fight. So he's probably not going to want to jump much anymore. Or he's associating the dressage rectangle with the fight, or he's associating the human with the fight, and he's just not going to want to associate himself with humans anymore. So fights are best to avoid, and especially if you understand the situations really clearly, you can avoid getting into those situations. One of the great things that happened over here in France is that as I tried to bring more horsemanship into the foundation training, they said, well, this is really good, let's give a name to it. And I said, well, it's called horsemanship. They said, well, we don't want to use an English name, so being that it's based upon the behavior of the horse, let's call it ethology. Let's call it equine ethology. And I thought, well, I don't actually know what that means. I don't know much about science, but, you know, as you want. So over here in France, it's known as équitation éthologique. And there's, you know, 50-odd thousand riders sort of getting into this stuff over here now. And as equitation éthologique started to go forward and say, okay, what is the ethogram of the horse? You know, what do horses need? Horses need social interaction, horses need to move, and horses need to eat fibre. You know, so one of the first things we needed to fix over here was, okay, horses don't live in boxes, they don't eat 3 meals a day, and they don't live alone, and they move. So, you know, get that fixed up. Make sure that your horses have social interaction, make sure they can move, and make sure they can eat fibre. Otherwise, you're going to have all sort of stereotypes and horses going mad. That's right at the beginning. And now from there, okay, how are we going to get a good foundation on these horses? But the scientists, well, they got a little bit excited saying, well, hang on, that's a scientific name, and these people don't know anything about science. So I turned back towards Australia, towards some great scientists, notably Andrew McLean, and said, okay, like I've studied this horsemanship in America, I've worked with the greatest, I'm working in Europe, I'm getting some pretty good results, I'm still running into trouble with some horses, and we've called this thing equitation ethologique, and I don't know much about science, can you help me? And so luckily I got a lot of help in the science department and started reading, studying, and funnily enough, I didn't actually think that it would be that I'd get as passionate about the subject as I did. And the science, it just clears everything up. And it's probably in the beginning, it's not so attractive. It's probably not the first thing. For years and years, I wanted to be a great horseman, and I just didn't look into the science of it. I thought, well, science, that's another thing, you know, that's the like laboratory rats and stuff like that, but that they don't bring it out into the paddock, or they don't take it to the barn, as we say. So, you know, what's the practical applications? But because we'd called this thing ethology, I thought, well, I better study and learn a bit about the science. And actually, for about the last 10 years, you know, that's probably been spinning around in my head just about all the time. And I've got to work with the real experts on training responses with different animals as well, but really understanding the science of learning. So understanding the horse's brain, and say, okay, is the horse capable of does he have moral capacity? Does he know good and bad and right and wrong? Well, he doesn't. Now, not everyone wants to agree with that, and that's fine. There's a big difference between science and beliefs. And probably in Europe, things are a little bit easier sometimes because they're not chasing a lot of belief systems. It's pretty cut and dried. They're more, as we say, Cartesian. They just if you can prove something scientifically, it's probably okay. But beliefs, saying, you know, oh well, this is a belief system, that's all a bit light for the French community. So things need to be pretty, okay, prove it to me, make sure it's right, and if I can see that it's correct, proven to be correct, I'll believe it. But if it's just a belief system, so, you know, when I first started using anthropomorphic ideas like, well, there's a herd and you need to be the boss of the herd and all that, they're kind of, it's a little bit vague. It's a little bit vague for what equitation is here. But if you actually say, well, the horse has, you know, 4 basic movements, and if you can get those 4 basic movements under stimulus control on the ground and on the horse's back, then all sorts of problem behaviours, conflictual behaviours, well, they suddenly disappear. You know, if you're really clear about this is stop, this is go, this is hindquarters, this is forequarters, and then start combining things within that, You know, your horse will be dressed, as they say over here. He'll be trained, like dressage. So getting those things and understanding that it's a lot of these anthropomorphic ideas about, am I the horse's leader? Is he respecting me? Am I the alpha? And things like that really weren't getting a great lot of public interest. But as I got more into the science and was able to say, this is what's actually happening. So if I was to say to somebody, well, you know, the horse, you can fit into his herd and you become the leader and the horse starts to follow you because horses like to follow leaders, and then he thinks that you're the greatest, and then what you say he obeys because he doesn't want to disappoint you and he wants to please you. You know, those sort of things, I think everyone wants to believe that. Whereas if I said, well, it's just conditioned responses, that it's pretty cold, isn't it? We condition responses. There's a stimulus, there's a response, and then there's a removal of the response of the stimulus when the horse responds correctly, and the horse obtains control over the stimulus because he can stop it at any time. Yeah, that's pretty, I think, whoa. I remember first talking about that. I was working for a big business here in France, and I said, I really think we need to go more towards a scientific explanation of what's actually happening. And I remember the boss at the time saying to me, but you know, clients aren't going to like that. They like the storytelling. And so I was thinking, well, is it actually going to work? And surprisingly or not, it's really worked out fabulously well, is combining the techniques of horsemanship with scientific explanations. This is what's really going on. Your horse is not trying to be wrong. He doesn't know how to be. It's just, are you using precise stimulus to obtain precise responses? And are you conditioning your responses with precision? Are you strict with yourself? Are you strict with the horse? And are you conditioning the responses with a lot of precision? And in the aquatic world, you know, where they're training dolphins and whales and things like that, I'm not talking about, you know, the ethical standards on that, because some people might say, oh, that's wrong, that's not ethical, we shouldn't put whales in swimming pools. Without getting into that debate, the aquatic world is really good on animal training. They're brilliant. And the dog world has got really good. But as I started learning about science, I suddenly realized that in the horse world, it's pretty pathetic. People don't know how to train responses, you know, get good stimulus-response relationships. I remember there was a study that was done, and they were asking top dog professionals, do you understand the difference between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, and can you give me some examples? And in the dog world, it was pretty good. You know, about 80% of them were getting it right. In the horse world, about 80% of them were getting it wrong. So suddenly, you know, and does that matter? And that's a really good question. Does it matter? Does it matter that the horse people don't know what negative reinforcement is, and they don't know what positive reinforcement is, that they don't know what operant conditioning is, and they don't know what Pavlovian or classical conditioning is? Does it matter? I would have said, 20 years ago, I would have said, oh, well, you know, that's just all words, that doesn't really matter. But now I'd have to say it makes all the difference, and really understanding the science and say, okay, how do I get conditioned responses? How do I teach the horse not to respond to things? You know, you can go back to the basics of comfortable and uncomfortable. This will make you comfortable, this won't, and that'll work. But there's a more precise level. If you really get into the science of it, there's another level where you can teach the horse, like we have to do in zoos with big animals. You know, you can't just play comfortable, uncomfortable, hot and cold with an elephant or with a tiger or something. If you need to needle that baby, you know, you need to really train something pretty precise, or you get a little bit trodden on or eaten or something. And it's pretty much the same with killer whales, I should think. I've never trained one, but you know, I know people that are really good elephant trainers, ethical elephant trainers. And you know, you've got to have a really good level of precision, whether you're using negative reinforcement or positive reinforcement, and understanding how to use the two, and understanding how to condition precise responses to precise cues. And in equitation in the horse world, we've been a little bit approximative with that. And I think probably the next thing that's going to happen, just, you know, travelled a lot, and I'm pretty passionate about the horse world, and I watch what's going on, and I know I follow a lot of people, whether it's on the social media or whatever, and find out what's going on in the horse world. And I think the next step, there'll be a real move towards science. I think a lot of people say, oh, well, I kind of taught myself and I figured things out, and I learned from observation. You get that a lot. You know, what you really need to do is just observe. You know, you can observe all you want, but if you know, Charles Darwin didn't show up and say, hey, look what's actually going on, you know, we'd still be observing. So science brings with it some really great clarity, so it makes things really clear. And without that science, we can be interpreting things a little incorrectly. Does it matter that we know that the world's round? We thought it was flat, but now it's round. Does it matter? Well, I suppose, you know, as evolution goes on, it gets pretty important as we're starting to move around the world so much easier. Does it really matter that we understand the theory of evolution now? Or would we have better off, you know, sticking to a belief system? Now, I talked about that a little earlier, and it's interesting because beliefs, people will die for beliefs. And, you know, I'll throw this video out there and people will get all sort of excited and say, I don't believe that the horse can't decide to be wrong. I don't believe that, you know, that science would actually improve horsemanship, or I don't know what. But beliefs, people will die for them. And humans have been dying for beliefs since forever. So they make up something, they believe it, and they're willing to die for it. Now, science, people die a little bit less for that. I'm not saying that, you know, Charles Darwin probably shouldn't have gone around visiting churches and explaining the evolution theory. That might not have worked out so well for him. But, you know, science, it's probably not something that touches the heart. I think science touches the brain and beliefs touch the heart. And people are so much more willing to do something from the heart than they are from the brain. You study any sort of marketing approach, they'll go for the emotions. They're not going to go for the intellectual understanding of, you know, why is this car a better car than this car due to the fact that we use this metal and we use this kind of firing system and because of this and this. You know, it's all about emotions, you know. Is this cup of coffee better than that cup of coffee? Or because there's George Clooney, well, that must be a good cup of coffee. So, you know, it's not about the quality of the coffee or where the coffee come from or how did they make that coffee or analyze that coffee or what's the actual, you know, taste test on that coffee. We don't care about that. What matters is that George Clooney's drinking that coffee and that must be a great coffee. So belief systems is very, very good. It's a great marketing tool, that's for sure. And it's also what humans want. They want to believe, they want to have belief systems. Science, it's a little bit harder to swallow, particularly when it explains things like, as I mentioned earlier, you know, when I ran into that wall and they suddenly said, oh no, your horse can't be disrespectful, it doesn't exist. He doesn't know about that. You know, there is no leadership interspecies. The intraspecies, like within the horse world, there's a leadership, there's a hierarchy, but, you know, humans don't get to be leaders in the animal world. And even in the dog world, that one's coming up now, and a lot of people are pretty uncomfortable with it. I mean, that's throwing a lot of theories, that a lot of belief systems that popped up in the 80s are now getting a lot of pressure put on them and saying, it's probably not what's actually going on. And that's going to upset some people. But that's evolution. That means that, and maybe what I'll talk about in the next videos, maybe in 20 years, I won't agree with me. And I'll say, well, that's what I thought, but, you know, I was off track. And even in this video, as I'm talking to you, it's exactly what's going on. 15, 20 years ago, I'd have told you there's a leadership and everything comes down to confidence and respect, and you need to be the leader and you need to... And now I'm not so sure that I'm right about that. Now I'm saying, okay, well, there is actually a science behind this, and if you can understand that science. And so that science, it's kind of basically works off about 3 levels. There's understanding associative responses, how to condition responses, and non-associative, also teaching the horse not to respond to things. So, you know, different desensitization techniques. And how do you, it's always a word, it popped up years ago in a clinic, and I got myself into a bit of trouble because the big boss, he didn't quite like that word desensitization, which I fully understand, because he said, I would never want to remove the sensitivity from the horse. And he's absolutely right, you wouldn't. You'd want to teach the horse to not respond to certain stimulus and also to be very light to others. So what you'd like is a horse that was very, very sensitive and scared of nothing. You know, that would be a great horse, wouldn't it? A horse that's really, really light, really sensitive, but afraid of nothing. And I guess once I got studying this science, I figured out you can have that horse. You know, knowing the different desensitization techniques, how to obtain habituation to certain things and teach the horse, these things don't matter, these things do matter. So you respond to these, you don't respond to those, and while you're responding to these, you can't listen to those anyway, and understanding different ways of overshadowing, things like that, that I didn't really know about. How to condition responses, how to use pressure and release, or how to use positive reinforcement as well, and how to remove pressures to their lightest possible level. It was always something that I guess trainers talked about even when I was a kid, you know. I remember a great horse trainer saying, if you sit on a nail, you'll stand up pretty quick, won't you, Andy? And I said, well, yeah, I should think so. And he said, well, you know, why did you stand up quick? And I said, well, because it hurt. No, that's not why you stood up. I said, well, okay. So why did you stand up? And I thought, I don't know, I sit on a nail, I'm going to stand up pretty quick because it hurts. No, that's not why you stand up. You need to think about this. Why did you stand up? Then the penny dropped and I thought, I stood up so the hurting stopped. There you go. So you sat on a nail and you stood up so that the nail stopped, so that the pressure went away, so that and trying to help me understand that it's not the pressure that gets the response, it's understanding how to remove it. Now, I'm not telling you to go and stick nails in your horses, but I'm just explaining that these theories were around, and this is going back into the 70s. But the science, you know, still had a little way to go, and probably understanding learning theory, how animals learn, and applying that to equitation, you know, that only really popped up in about 2004, 2006. It started to move along. Now it's moving along really well. And applying science to horsemanship, we've got a little way to go there. And probably one of the harder things to do now will be to say, okay, we can apply the science to horsemanship, but there might be a few older belief systems that we need to tidy up. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit with horseman science, is how can we apply science to our horsemanship and have a clearer understanding of what's actually going on. So the associative learning processes, the non-associative learning processes, the conditioning of responses with operant conditioning and with classical conditioning. Like, you know, a lot of people know about Pavlov and how the dog would start to make saliva when he sounded the buzzer, and the dog knew what was going to happen before what happened. And I guess most people in horses know that horses learn to anticipate what's going to happen before what happens. But how can you use that? And how could you teach a horse to respond to a tiny signal, and you wouldn't have to use the pressure and release system? And suddenly you'd be having these really light signals, just might be just a little change of weight or a little change of pressure, maybe just a little body language thing, and you can get those things so fine, because, you know, the horse is a very perceptive animal. If he wasn't perceptive, he wouldn't still be here. You know, animals that weren't really perceptive, they got eaten, they got extinct. So the horse is a very perceptive animal, and if you can use that sensitivity, and you can reduce things to, and it's incredible just how little it takes sometimes. And there we go again, you know, I just blurted out another great horsemanship word, you know, see how little it takes. And probably the science behind it, you start to think, wow, I didn't realize that you could get it that fine. If I understood classical conditioning, I would have been giving a tiny signal before I used the pressure, and then that way the tiny signal starts to make sense, and now the tiny signal is obtaining the response. But, you know, you need to know that that's possible, and also understanding the science behind it and the timing. You know, if you're going to use a signal and then a stimulus, how long do I have between the two before the horse starts to not make the association between the two? You know, if I tell the horse to whoa this morning and I stop him this afternoon, probably not going to make the connection. So how many strides? What's the timing? All these things there, and that's where the science fits in, and it becomes really interesting. And then again, how to use your different reinforcements. So you've got your associative learning, your non-associative learning, the conditioning, operant conditioning, classical conditioning, positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. And understanding, you know, what negative reinforcement is, because the first time I heard the word, I would have assumed that it meant punishment or something. It was making things uncomfortable. Making, you know, when the horse did something wrong, make him uncomfortable so that there's a consequence. As if the horse could suddenly understand that, you know, that system, like punishment. which of course, you know, thanks to the science, we know that he can't. He doesn't have that reasoning capacity to say, okay, because I did that happened, so I should have done another thing, and then that wouldn't have happened, and I'd be, you know, the day that horses get a prefrontal cortex and start reasoning and analyzing and thinking the way we do, you know, I don't know who's going to be able to break in a horse. A better man than me, because it's going to be pretty tough when the horses start saying, well, I weigh 600 kilos and you weigh too many but not enough, so, you know, it's not going to work out for you. You know, people just aren't, it's not going to happen anymore. So we should think ourselves lucky that horses don't have frontal lobes and aren't able to look at the situation, analyze the situation and calculate what am I going to do about this. They're living in the moment. You know, one of the things, even in the horsemanship world, I realize when you're starting young horses, is you've got to be in the present moment. You can't be worried about, you know, who telephoned who and what happened there, and, you know, when you're going to go here and there and the rest of the day. You've got to be there in the moment. And that's probably the best place to be, because that's where the horse is. He's just always there. He's not worried about, you know, dinner tonight or any of those other things. So he's living in the moment, and you need to be really precise and say, okay, well, if he's not making up plans and things like that, you know, how am I going to help the horse through the situation? And then negative reinforcement, understanding that it means, negative in science means subtractive, it means removal. Positive means we add something, so the horse does something good, I can add something attractive to the horse. And if the horse gets, if I put some pressure on the horse and he moves forward, well, you know, the horse learns to go forward by the removal of the pressure of my legs, for example. The horse learns to stop by the removal of the pressure from my hands, for example. Of course, I could always use some Pavlovian in there and use a seat. Do something with the seat before I did something with the hands, and now the horse will learn to respond to the seat. Well, that would be good, wouldn't it? So, but understanding that it's the removal of the horse. You know, horses learn to stop by the removal of the pressure of the reins. You know, when I moved over here to France, you ask anyone, how do horses learn to stop? They tell you what to do to stop the horse. But they didn't know how the horse learned to stop. And that probably, at least as far as foundation training, that was getting them into trouble. But when they realize, okay, it's the removal of the pressure that the horse is looking for, that changes things. And that pressure removal, the mastering of that pressure removal, is called negative reinforcement. And once you get the negative reinforcement right, there's a whole lot of application in there for positive reinforcement. You know, I thought it just meant having a couple of carrots in your pocket and giving them to the horse from time to time. But it's actually really, really precise. There's ways of bridging gaps between, you know, when the horse gets something right and when you give him the carrot. And it's actually quite a science. So horse training is actually quite a science. And horsemanship is actually quite a science. And I think probably the thing that I'd like to talk about in these videos, and maybe we'll get out there in the sand with a few horses and start looking at that and say, okay, what is the science behind good horsemanship? So that's the idea with Horseman Science. It's been a great ride for me, and I think you'll find it equally interesting. A few more things to talk about, so we're going to make a few more videos about that and really understand, okay, what's going on inside the horse's head, what motivates the horse, and how could I fix the situation so that I'm taking care of his objective and not just taking care of mine. So it's going to be an interesting ride. Stay tuned, lots more videos to come, and I hope you enjoyed that little story about how did Horseman Science come about. We'll see you in another video soon. Bye now.